Hi, this is Kevin at the Virtual Planetarium at Raritan Valley Community College. Welcome to our weekly Star Talk. Today we're going to be talking about a few things, a few deep sky objects that we can see around the constellation of Perseus that we talked about 2 weeks ago. These are going to be a few objects that we can see with binoculars, so it's pretty cool that these are things you can see yourself from your own backyard. But before we do that, let's talk about our upcoming moon phases. We have a new moon on November 4th, we have a first quarter moon on November 11th, and then we have a full moon on November 19th. This full moon on November 19th is actually really cool because it's going to be a lunar eclipse. We'll talk about that more as that date gets closer though. Now, like I said, today we're going to be talking about different deep sky objects that we can see with just a pair of binoculars around the constellation of Perseus and Andromeda and Cassiopeia that we talked about a few weeks ago. Last week we talked about Halloween. Today's Halloween. That's why I'm a floating head in today's video, so that's pretty fun. But we won't be talking about Halloween today, except one of the deep sky objects that we'll be seeing is a little spooky, so we'll get into that in a second. The first group we're going to talk about is in the constellation, the first object we're going to talk about is in the constellation of Perseus. Perseus, again, we can find it by using the constellation of Cassiopeia up here. So Cassiopeia is recognizable because of this sideways W right over here, and then Perseus is the blob of stars that's right under it. Now, the first object we're going to see actually lies directly in between these two groups of stars. If you were to point your binoculars directly in between this sideways W and this bright star right here, and you zoom in with your binoculars, you're going to notice that there is a blob of stars right here. More specifically, there are two blobs of stars side by side, and this is something called the double cluster. The double cluster is cool because, again, it's something we can see very easily with binoculars. It's actually something you don't want to look at through a telescope because it's so big in the sky that a telescope you won't be able to appreciate the whole thing. So you can point your binoculars at this part of the sky right here, and you're going to see two clusters of stars. Now, these are two open clusters, and that means that there is no particular shape to them. They just look like blobs of stars, like a group of stars. But these two happen to be very close to each other, and so when we look at them through binoculars, when we look at them in the sky, we see this really cool sight right here. So this is something we can see very easily from our own backyards. And again, it's right in between the constellation of Cassiopeia right here and the constellation of Perseus right under here. We'll just add the constellation names for everybody. The second object we're going to look at is actually in the constellation of Andromeda. And just to recap how to find Andromeda in the sky, if you look towards the east, we currently have the sky set up for Halloween today for about 9 o'clock at night. And if you look towards the east, southeast, you find a very big square of stars in the sky. Let me zoom in. Whoopsie. Let me zoom in a little more so that's easier to find. This right here, these four stars are called the Great Square of Pegasus. And then this bottom star here, the one closest to Cassiopeia, is the shared star between Pegasus and Andromeda. And then the constellation of Andromeda is just this line of stars right here. Now, the next object we're going to find is actually the furthest thing we can see with just our naked eyes. And this is the Great Andromeda Galaxy. If we start from this shared star right here, and we move down one star and then two stars, and then from this star, if we go hop up one and two more stars, we see that there is a fuzzy blob right off of that star right there. Now again, this is the furthest thing we can see with our naked eye, but you do have to be in a very dark spot to be able to see it. So if you're close to city lights or close to town lights, you need to move away from those lights so you're able to see this a lot easier. But with a pair of binoculars on a clear night, you would still be able to see this very easily. And again, this is the Great Andromeda Galaxy. This is our closest major galactic neighbor. It is about 2.5 million light years away. So it's really, really far. And again, it's the furthest thing we can see with our naked eye. And this big thing right here is the Andromeda Galaxy. And then it also has a little satellite galaxy that you can see with a small telescope. And that's this little blob right up here. This right here is actually a picture we took here at the RVCC Planetarium with one of our telescopes. We pointed up at the constellation. We let the camera run for about an hour to be able to collect enough light to see all these really cool details. Now, when you look at it through some binoculars, you're only going to see the very center right here. And that's because our eyes aren't that sensitive, so they can't collect that much light. And you won't be able to see as much as you can see in those really nice pictures that we see online or right here in this program. A really fun fact about the Andromeda Galaxy is that if the whole thing were bright enough, to see the whole big thing in the sky, it would actually be as wide as 4 full moons. That's really big. That's just to give you a sense of how big the galaxy actually is in our sky. Again, we only see the very center because that's the only part that's bright enough for us to see, but the whole thing is that big. Here we have a really cool composite image. It's not a real picture that's overlaid, but it's actually the right sizes. So that's really neat. And now the last object we're going to talk about that we can find in this part of the sky, we actually talked about it in last week's video when we talked about spooky things in the sky, and it lies in the constellation of Cassiopeia. So when we find the constellation of Cassiopeia, there's the sideways W right here. And you want to find the first peak right here, the one that's not that deep, or the one that's closer to the constellation of Perseus. Now, if you find that dip or that peak right here, and then you go to this star, if you follow this line of stars and go to this first star right here, when we zoom into that, we find that it's one of the eyes of the Owl cluster. So again, this is one of the groups of stars we talked about last week for our Halloween show, because it is an open cluster of stars that kind of looks like an owl. Some people also call this the ET cluster. I'm not sure how they see ET here, but some people also call it the Dragonfly cluster, and that I can imagine. Because again, we have these two very bright stars that are like the eyes of the owl or the dragonfly, and then we see these stars that spread out in this direction that kind of look like the wings, and then the body right here are these other stars. And this is really cool because again, this is something you can see with binoculars, and you'll be able to make out the owl even through binoculars. So that's really, really fun and cool that you can see it from your own backyard with even just a small pair of binoculars, like bird watching binoculars. The bigger the binoculars, the better, obviously, but if you don't have any big pair of binoculars, then you can use whatever you have lying around, and that should be enough to see all 3 of these cool objects in the sky. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you learned something new. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel. And if you like this video, please be sure to give us a like. We'll be putting out a new video every week talking about different cool things in the sky. Thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a great week.